at the BookTube. It's Roz. Now, of all my kind of best of the year videos, this one is probably the most niche, but I'm going to presume if you're watching it, it's because you are interested in plays and poetry, so I'll just sort of plough on. Now, some years I could give you a top 5 just of plays, but 2024 is not one of those years. I have been reading plays, about a dozen maybe, and but because I exclude rereads from my best of lists, the best plays that I read this year were rereads, various Oscar Wilde ones and The Lovely Charlie's Aunt by Brandon Thomas. So there isn't a top 5 plays, but I will give you 3 quick kind of honourable mentions of plays that I'm particularly glad that I read this year, even though they weren't stellar reads, if that makes sense. And first of those would be Belle's Strategem, play from 1780 by Hannah Cowley, and British playwright. And the reason why was I glad that I read that, it was funny, it was kind of smart and lively, not amazing, but the interest of it for me was seeing how reading and watching and even performing in at home in plays like the Belle Stratagem and other similar plays really influenced the writing of Jane Austen. They did a lot of kind of like amateur dramatics or play readings in the Austen family and her friendship group. But also she went to the theatre a lot, and you can see some of the themes from Belle Stratagem kind of pop up and character types and so on in Austen's novels. So that was fun. Then the other 2 both were in Victober and October Victorian writing. You know that if you're watching this, don't you? And one of those was the best kind of watch and read experiences of the year, because I read Dion Boucicault's play from 1841, called London Assurance, and that was okay reading it. But I watched the National Theatre production of it on video, on National Theatre at Home, with Fiona Shaw, and it was just brilliant, hysterically funny, wonderful production. It totally brought the thing to life, kind of subtly updated a few elements, and brilliant experience. But yeah, reading the play was not so amazing. The third play I'm going to mention was the most stimulating read of a drama I did this year, and that was Alan's Wife by Florence, Belle and Elizabeth Robbins. Came out in 1893, was considered quite shocking at the time, and it still actually brings you up short when you read it, because the 2 of them were both kind of British feminists and suffragists, and really interested in the rights of women and women's education and women's experience. And it's a play about a working class woman and marriage, widowhood, motherhood. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Not the most amazing writing, but really fascinating. So 3 interesting plays, but none of them in my sort of top reads of the year. Whereas some of the poetry I read this year is absolutely in my tops of the year. So I'm going to give you a top 5. And unusually, I did read a lot of really great contemporary poetry. I read some, but only one of those made it into this top 5, and that's at the bottom, in position number 5, and that's The Home Child by Liz Berry, which came out in early 2024. British poet. She based it on the experience of her real life great aunt, who was sent to Canada as a child. It was a kind of a scheme in the 20th century to take like children from British orphanages and farm them out to the colonies, to Canada, to Australia, and somewhere between, well, closer to child slavery than adoption. And this is like a novel in verse. It's really moving, short, quite special. Yeah. So that's at number 5. At number 4, I've actually got the book to show you because Home Child was from the library. Is one of those poetry collections that kind of goes through the entire life's work of a poet and picks out key poems to give you a feeling of how their poetry evolved over their lifetime and the sort of highs of their career. And this is the poems of Nazim Hikmet. It was given to me by Berner's Books Adventures. It's Hikmet was probably the sort of most significant 20th century Turkish poet. This was translated by Randy Blasing and Mutlu Konuk. The poems in it range from the very end of the 1920s through to the early 1960s, just before he died. Many of them were written when he was in prison or in exile, because he was very much a political figure as well as a poet. They are political poems. They're also very personal. It was a fascinating read, and many beautiful poems, but also for seeing, how his poetry sort of shifted over his lifetime and what stayed the same. Then, in at number 3 is another novel in verse, but a very different one. It's this. In Parenthesis by David Jones. This was published in 1937, but it's based on Jones's experiences as an ordinary soldier in the trenches in World War I. And it is, I think, the most vivid and moving portrayal in poetry of that experience of being, an ordinary soldier in the trenches in that awful conflict, but written through sort of very impressionistic, modernist kind of poetry that draws on British folklore, old Welsh literature in particular. It has characters, it has plot. It wouldn't be a novel otherwise, would it? But it's an unusual reading experience. But if you're up for a challenge, and you're interested in World War I and human beings, here's one for you. Which brings me to my top 2. Now, number 2, we go much further back in time, okay? Because it's this. Homer's Iliad. So where we're going back to around, it's a little uncertain, but kind of like 8th century BCE, that sort of time. And epic poetry, Greek, a cornerstone of human literature, I suppose. So, and one that I've dipped into in the past, but I've never read as a book, read from start to finish, and experienced the whole journey of the poem, of the story, so all in one go. I actually read 2 translations, this one by Robert Fagles, and then I listened to an even newer translation by Emily Wilson. Listening to the Iliad was a brilliant idea, because although it was written down possibly by one person, maybe with a scribe, not scribes, but one person's version but was grown out of an oral tradition of poetry, and was almost expected to be spoken or read aloud. What really struck me in reading this, the whole thing, all in one go, as it were, or the spread of a time, obviously, is the extraordinary sort of structure of it as a book. Like, we think we know the story of the Trojan War, well, the myth, the legend of the Trojan War, but this just comes for a short period, really intense, not at the beginning, not the very end, but like a little bit just before the end. Really powerful events, but as a story arc, it's fascinating because it's really about, Achilles' anger and his relationship with Agamemnon and how that plays out. And I'm so happy to have made the time and effort to read this. And if you want to just sort of revel in it, try listening to the Emily Wilson on audio, because it's just very, very listenable and comprehensible, and yet captures the poetic nature of the writing. And the fascination for me, I suppose, is about how human beings are the same, and yet our kind of sometimes our culture and our ideas and how we live has been so very different over time, and that's the sort of the combination in this. Now, if that's my number 2, you must be saying, what could knock the Iliad off the top spot in your years reading of poetry, Ros? Well, it's a good question, and only one thing could. Okay, and that was this. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So published around 1400, from 1387 up to 1400. He hadn't quite finished it when he died, but it was sort of pulled together by after his death. Why is this my number 1? And the Iliad my number 2? Because the Iliad I can only read in translation. I mean, I have read tiny little bits of it in the original Greek when I was able to do that, and that was a wonderful experience. But you don't have that direct connection with the author and the book when it's in translation. Whereas this time, I've dipped into this before. I've read some of the tales in translation. I've read excerpts in the original Middle English, but this time I bit the bullet and I read the whole thing in Middle English, and in a glorious buddy read with Joe, also known as Too Tight to Trek. Thank you so much, Joe, for that experience. At first it was hard, but the longer you stick with it, the more of it you read, the more the Middle English, certainly Chaucer's Middle English, which was sort of a late-ish Middle English, London sort of dialect, the more comprehensible it becomes, to the point where, by the time I was getting to the end of the book, I could just read it as you'd read another book, with the odd word that you think, I don't know what that word is, which can happen, in a contemporary book, can't it? You can think, I've got to stop and look that word up, but it and that meant that I was directly experiencing his language, what he wrote, what his thoughts were, and what his poetry was, the language and how he plays with it, and the sounds. The poetry in this is all about sound and rhythm, but particularly about sound. So you lose so much when you're reading a modern translation. Having said that, what you do get in translation is the stories, the characters, the ideas, the sort of morality and politics that he throws in. That there is loads to enjoy in a translation of the Canterbury Tales, but to appreciate the poetry to the full, and why this is my number 1 poetry reading experience of the year, you need to be reading the actual original language. So there we go. What were your top plays? I would love to hear about, but top poetry of the year, and maybe the contemporary poetry that I should have read and didn't, if it didn't make my top 5.